The plane descended slowly, breaking through the blanket of thick clouds that hung low over the mountains. Cecil Smith stared out the small window, watching as the jagged peaks of the Alaskan range came into view. They looked the same as they had 2 decades ago, vast, imposing, and indifferent. A part of him had hoped the land would have changed as much as he had, but nature, unlike people, didn't seem to care about time. The small village of Timber Falls appeared next, nestled in a valley between the mountains. It was a collection of modest houses, most of them log cabins, clustered around a single main street. The airstrip was little more than a stretch of cleared land, a far cry from the bustling military bases Cecil had grown accustomed to. As the plane touched down, a wave of nostalgia washed over him, along with a deep sense of unease. Cecil disembarked with a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. The cold air hit him immediately, biting through his jacket. He paused for a moment, taking it in, the smell of pine, the distant howl of wind through the trees, the silence that came from being so far removed from civilization. This was home. And yet, it wasn't. A familiar figure stood waiting near the edge of the airstrip. Martha, his sister, looked older than he remembered. Her once dark hair was streaked with gray, her face lined with the years of worry and responsibility she had carried in his absence. She wore a thick parka, arms crossed against the cold, her expression unreadable. Cecil approached her, forcing a smile. "Martha." She nodded, her eyes scanning his face as if searching for the brother she once knew. "Cecil. It's been a long time." "Too long," he admitted, shifting uncomfortably. He wanted to say more, to explain why he had stayed away for so many years, why he had only sent sporadic letters and made even fewer phone calls. But the words stuck in his throat. Martha turned toward the village. "I thought you'd never come back." Cecil followed her gaze. "I wasn't sure I would." They walked in silence to Martha's truck, the crunch of gravel under their boots the only sound. As they drove into the village, Cecil noticed the subtle changes: new houses, a small school that hadn't been there before, and a general store that looked freshly painted. Yet the essence of Timber Falls remained the same. It was still a place that existed on the edge of the world, isolated and resilient. When they reached the cabin that Cecil had inherited from their father, Martha parked the truck and handed him the keys. "It's all yours now. I haven't changed much inside. Figured you'd want to do that yourself." Cecil nodded, gripping the keys tightly. "Thanks. For keeping it up all these years. It was Dad's place. Didn't feel right to let it fall apart." She hesitated, then added, "If you need anything. You know where I am." "Yeah. I appreciate it, Martha." She gave him a small nod, her face softening for a brief moment before the distance returned. "Well, I'll let you get settled. You take care, Cecil." He watched her drive away, a lump forming in his throat. The estrangement between them weighed heavily on him, and he wondered if it was too late to bridge the gap. But that was a worry for another day. Right now, he had to focus on reclaiming the life he had left behind. Inside the cabin, everything was as he remembered: rustic, sturdy, and functional. The fireplace was cold, the wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the walls were adorned with hunting trophies and framed photos of a family that no longer existed. Cecil dropped his duffel bag by the door and stood in the center of the room, listening to the silence. It felt more like a museum than a home. He moved to the mantel, picking up a photo of himself and Martha as children, standing beside their father in front of a freshly caught salmon. They were smiling, carefree, before life had taken them down separate paths. He set the photo down and turned toward the window. The wilderness beckoned to him, offering a solace he couldn't find within 4 walls. The next morning, Cecil woke before dawn, the old habits of military life hard to break. After a quick breakfast of coffee and toast, he donned his gear and set out into the forest. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched under his boots as he followed a trail that wound through the trees. The forest felt alive, pulsing with a quiet energy that soothed his restless mind. As he walked, he came across familiar landmarks: the old oak tree where he and Martha had carved their initials, the creek where he had caught his first fish, and the clearing where their father had taught them how to hunt. The memories were bittersweet, reminding him of a simpler time. But there were also new sights, signs that the forest had moved on without him. He paused by a patch of freshly fallen trees, likely brought down by a recent storm. As a forester, it would be his job to assess the damage, to ensure the forest remained healthy and vibrant. It was a responsibility he welcomed, something tangible, something he could control. As he knelt to inspect the fallen timber, a soft rustling in the underbrush caught his attention. He froze, his instincts kicking in. Slowly, he turned his head and saw them, 3 wolves emerging from the shadows of the trees. They were sleek and powerful, their fur a mix of gray, white, and black. The largest one, likely the alpha, locked eyes with Cecil, its yellow gaze steady and unblinking. For a moment, man and beast regarded each other in silence. Cecil's heart raced, but he didn't move. He knew better than to show fear. The wolves seemed to sense this, their postures relaxing slightly. The alpha stepped forward, sniffing the air, then turned and led the pack away, disappearing into the forest as silently as they had come. Cecil exhaled slowly, a strange sense of awe and connection settling over him. He had always respected the wolves, admired their strength and independence. They were survivors, just like him. As he stood up and continued his trek through the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter had been significant, as if the wolves had acknowledged him, accepted his presence in their territory. Later that evening, after a long day in the forest, Cecil found himself at Martha's house. He stood on the porch for a moment, hesitating, before knocking. The door opened, and Martha stood there, surprised to see him. "Cecil?" she asked, her voice softening. "Yeah. I thought maybe we could have dinner. Talk a bit." Martha studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Come on in. I made stew." They sat at the small kitchen table, the warmth of the fireplace easing the tension between them. The smell of the stew was comforting, reminding Cecil of the meals their mother used to make. For a while, they ate in silence, the clinking of silverware the only sound. Finally, Martha spoke, her voice hesitant. How are you holding up?" Cecil sighed, setting down his spoon. "It's been different. Coming back here. Feels like a lifetime ago when I left." "You're not the only one who's changed," Martha replied, her gaze distant. "The village isn't the same. People move on. Things aren't as simple as they used to be." He nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "I know. I'm sorry, Martha. For everything. For leaving you to handle everything here. For not being in touch more." Martha looked at him, her eyes softening. "I was angry for a long time. But I get it now. You had your reasons. Just don't disappear again, okay?" "I won't," Cecil promised, meaning every word. "I'm here to stay this time." They fell into a more comfortable silence, the bond between them slowly mending. As they finished their meal, Cecil realized that this was the first step, not just in repairing his relationship with Martha, but in finding his place in the world again. The wilderness outside called to him, offering peace and purpose. But it was the connections inside these walls, the people he had once loved and lost, that would truly guide him home. The summer had been unusually dry. The forest, once a lush expanse of greenery, now felt brittle and tense, like a matchstick waiting to ignite. Cecil had noticed the signs: dry creek beds, parched vegetation, and an eerie stillness in the air that made the animals more restless than usual. As a forester, he knew the dangers, but nothing could have prepared him for the inferno that was about to descend upon Timber Falls. It started with a distant rumble, barely audible over the sound of the wind. Cecil was in the heart of the forest, inspecting the regrowth in an area that had been cleared for timber last winter. The forest had a way of healing itself, given time and care, but today, something was off. He paused, narrowing his eyes at the horizon. The sky, once a clear blue, had taken on a strange, ominous hue, orange and gray, like bruised skin. The smell of smoke hit him next, sharp and acrid. His heart raced as he turned in the direction of the wind, which now carried the unmistakable scent of burning wood. Cecil quickly pulled out his radio, dialing into the village frequency. "Timber Falls, this is Cecil. We've got a fire brewing to the east, near the old clearing. Looks like it's spreading fast." A crackling pause, then a voice he recognized as Sheriff Tom's came through. "Roger that, Cecil. We've got eyes on it. Get back to the village, and we'll coordinate from there." Cecil didn't waste time. He knew that out here, every second mattered. He grabbed his gear and began making his way back through the forest, his boots pounding the dry earth as he navigated the familiar trails. The wind was picking up, pushing the fire closer with every gust. By the time he reached the outskirts of the village, the sky was thick with smoke, and the sun had turned into a hazy, blood-red orb. The town was in a flurry of activity. People were scrambling to protect their homes, dousing roofs with water, packing up valuables, and ushering children into trucks. Martha was standing outside her house, barking orders at a couple of men who were securing the windows with plywood. Cecil approached her, wiping the sweat from his brow. "How bad is it?" Martha looked at him, her face grim. "It's the worst we've seen in years. The wind's not doing us any favors, either. The fire's moving faster than we can control." Cecil nodded, surveying the scene. The fire was still a ways off, but the thickening smoke and the distant glow of flames painted a bleak picture. He noticed the firefighters gathered near the town's edge, trying to establish a containment line. "I'll head out with the crew. We need to stop this thing before it reaches the village," Cecil said, already turning to leave. Martha grabbed his arm, her eyes filled with concern. "Be careful, Cecil. That fire's unpredictable." He squeezed her hand briefly. "I will. You keep an eye on things here, okay?" She nodded, releasing him. "Just come back in one piece, brother." Cecil joined the firefighting crew, led by Sheriff Tom, who looked as weathered and tough as the land they were trying to protect. The team consisted of locals, men and women who had faced wildfires before but knew that this one was different. The tension in the air was palpable. Tom handed Cecil a helmet and a fire axe. "We're going to try and cut a fire break on the northern side, near the ridge. If we can keep it from jumping that line, we might have a chance of stopping it before it gets any closer to the village." Cecil nodded. "Let's do it." The crew moved quickly, their coordinated efforts fueled by urgency and determination. As they approached the fire line, the heat became unbearable, like standing too close to an open furnace. The roar of the flames drowned out all other sounds, a constant, deafening reminder of the power they were up against. Cecil worked alongside the others, hacking away at trees and brush to create a barrier between the advancing flames and the village. The fire was relentless, devouring everything in its path with an insatiable hunger. Every time they made progress, a gust of wind would send embers flying, igniting new blazes that threatened to engulf them. Amid the chaos, Cecil spotted movement in the distance, something that didn't belong in the inferno. His heart skipped a beat when he realized what it was, a pack of wolves, the same ones he had encountered weeks earlier. They were trapped, hemmed in by the flames, their only escape route cut off by the advancing fire. Without hesitation, Cecil dropped his axe and turned to Tom. "There are wolves trapped in the fire line. I'm going after them." Tom glanced at the flames and then back at Cecil, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Are you out of your damn mind? You can't save them, Cecil. The fire's too close." "I have to try," Cecil shouted over the roar of the flames. "I won't leave them to die." Tom hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. "Fine. But be quick. We're pulling out soon, and I don't want to have to come back for you." Cecil gave him a brief nod and sprinted toward the wolves. The heat was suffocating, and the smoke stung his eyes, but he pressed on, determined to reach them. As he got closer, he saw the alpha wolf pacing nervously, the younger wolves huddled together, their fear palpable. Cecil called out to them, his voice hoarse. "Come on. This way." The alpha turned toward him, recognizing him from their previous encounter. For a moment, they locked eyes again, And Cecil saw the same resilience, the same will to survive. He moved closer, slowly, trying not to startle them. The flames were closing in fast, and the smoke was thickening, making it harder to breathe. "Let's go," Cecil urged, waving his arms to get them moving. The alpha barked sharply, and the pack began to follow Cecil as he led them toward a narrow path that cut through the trees. The fire was dangerously close now, licking at the edges of the trail, but Cecil pushed forward, guiding the wolves through the inferno. His lungs burned with every breath, and his clothes were singed by flying embers, but he refused to slow down. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they broke through the fire line and into a clearing where the flames had not yet reached. Cecil collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his body trembling from exhaustion. The wolves circled him, their eyes watchful, as if acknowledging his role in their survival. One of the younger wolves, a pup, approached him cautiously, sniffing at his hand. Cecil chuckled weakly and patted its head. "You're safe now." The alpha wolf let out a low howl, a sound that echoed through the clearing, resonating with a deep sense of gratitude. Then, with a final glance at Cecil, the wolves turned and disappeared into the forest, their sleek forms vanishing into the shadows. Cecil sat there for a moment, catching his breath and watching the flames from a distance. The fire break they had created had slowed the fire's advance, giving the village a fighting chance. He knew there was still much work to be done, but in that moment, a strange sense of peace settled over him. He had saved the wolves, saved something wild and free from the destruction that threatened to consume them all. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he had come back to this place, why he had chosen to return to the wilderness despite everything he had lost. Later that night, back in the village, Cecil found himself at Martha's house again. She opened the door, her eyes widening when she saw the state he was in, his clothes singed, his face smudged with soot, and his hands trembling from the adrenaline that still coursed through his veins. "Dear God, Cecil, what happened?" she asked, pulling him inside. Cecil sank into a chair, too tired to stand. "We managed to hold the fire back. For now, at least." Martha handed him a glass of water, her expression softening. "You look like you've been through hell." He chuckled weakly. "Pretty close to it." She sat down across from him, her eyes searching his face. "What is it, Cecil? What's got you looking so different?" Cecil took a deep breath, staring into the glass of water as if it held all the answers. "I saved a pack of wolves today. They were trapped in the fire, and I couldn't just leave them." Martha blinked, surprise flickering across her features. "Wolves? You risked your life for wolves?" He nodded slowly. "I did. And I'd do it again." Martha was silent for a moment, then she smiled, really smiled, the kind of smile he hadn't seen in years. "You've always had a soft spot for the wild things, Cecil. I guess some things never change." He looked up at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe not everything has to." They sat together in the quiet of the night, the fire still burning in the distance but no longer threatening to tear their world apart. In that moment, Cecil felt a sense of connection, both to the land he had once called home and to the sister who had always been there, waiting for him to find his way back. The weeks following the fire were a time of renewal, not only for the forest but also for the people of Timber Falls. The flames had scarred the land, leaving blackened trees and ash-covered ground in their wake, yet beneath the devastation, life slowly began to emerge. Tiny green shoots pushed their way through the charred earth, and the air, once thick with smoke, now carried the scent of rain and new growth. For Cecil, it was a time of reflection, a chance to rebuild not just the land, but his life. Cecil stood at the edge of the forest, looking out at the recovering landscape. The wolves had vanished into the wilderness after the fire, but he felt their presence, a reminder of the connection he had forged with the wild creatures. They had survived, just as he had. But his thoughts were soon interrupted by the sound of an approaching car. Turning, he saw Addie's old, beat-up truck rumbling down the dirt road. Addie had changed too. Her baby, John, was now a few months old, and the weight of motherhood had softened her rough edges. She parked the truck and stepped out, cradling John in her arms as she walked over to Cecil. "Uncle Cecil," she called, her voice light and hopeful. "I brought you lunch." Cecil smiled, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You didn't have to do that, Addie. But I'm glad you did." They sat down on a fallen log, and Addie handed him a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. John gurgled happily, reaching out to grab Cecil's finger with his tiny hand. "He likes you," Addie said with a laugh. "You're good with him." Cecil looked at the baby, his heart swelling with a mix of emotions. "I wasn't sure I would be," he admitted. "I've been out here on my own for so long. Sometimes I forget how to be around people, especially kids." Addie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You've always been good at taking care of others, even if you don't realize it. You took care of me when I had nowhere else to go. And now? Well, now you're helping me take care of him." Cecil shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just doing what I can." "You've been through a lot, Addie. More than anyone should have to handle." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Do you ever think about the past, Uncle Cecil? About why things turned out the way they did?" Cecil looked out at the forest, his mind drifting back to the years he had spent away from Timber Falls. "I used to," he said slowly. "I used to think about it all the time. The choices I made, the things I lost. But being back here, it's made me realize that the past doesn't have to define us. We can choose to move forward, to rebuild." Addie looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Do you think that's what I should do? Move forward?" Cecil met her gaze, his voice steady. "Yes. I think that's exactly what you should do." Later that day, Addie left Cecil's cabin with John in tow, but her words lingered in his mind. She was strong, stronger than she knew, but she was also fragile, like the new growth in the forest. She needed time, and he was determined to give her that, to be the steady presence she could rely on. The days passed in a steady rhythm, the village gradually returning to normal. The fire had been a wake-up call for everyone, a reminder of the fragile balance between human life and the natural world. The village council organized efforts to replant trees and restore the damaged areas, and Cecil found himself at the forefront of those efforts, using his skills as a forester to guide the process. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Cecil found himself at the local bar, nursing a cold beer. The place was buzzing with life, villagers laughing, sharing stories, and celebrating their resilience. Cecil was content to sit quietly at the bar, observing the scene, when Charlie, his trusted assistant and friend, slid onto the stool next to him. "Hey, Cecil," Charlie greeted him with a grin. "How's it going?" Cecil raised his beer in response. "Not bad. Just taking it all in." Charlie nodded, his eyes scanning the room before settling on Addie, who was sitting at a table with a group of young mothers. "She's doing better, huh?" Cecil followed his gaze and smiled. "Yeah, she is. She's stronger than she gives herself credit for." Charlie hesitated for a moment, then asked, Do you think she's ready to move on?" Cecil glanced at Charlie, reading the unspoken question in his friend's eyes. He had noticed the way Charlie looked at Addie, the way his face softened when she entered a room, the way he always found an excuse to be near her. It wasn't just concern. It was something deeper. "Charlie," Cecil began, his voice low and steady, "if you're asking for my permission, you don't need it. But if you're asking for my advice, I'd say go for it. She deserves someone who will treat her right, and I know you're that kind of man." Charlie exhaled, a relieved smile breaking across his face. "Thanks, Cecil. I needed to hear that." As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, but the weight of that moment stayed with Cecil. He knew that life was moving forward, that change was inevitable, and he welcomed it. A few months later, the village gathered in the clearing by the river, the same place where Cecil had saved the wolves from the fire. But this time, the occasion was far more joyous. Addie and Charlie stood together beneath an arch of wildflowers, exchanging bows as the entire village watched. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and the river sparkled in the sunlight. Cecil stood off to the side, his heart swelling with pride as he watched his niece take this brave step forward. Martha stood next to him, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "She's beautiful, isn't she?" Martha whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She is," Cecil agreed, his voice barely audible over the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. As Addie and Charlie kissed, sealing their union, the crowd erupted into cheers. Cecil couldn't help but smile as he watched his niece, now a wife, embrace her new life with open arms. It was a moment of rebirth for her, a chance to start fresh, and Cecil knew that she would make the most of it. After the ceremony, as the celebration continued, Addie approached Cecil, her eyes bright with happiness. She hugged him tightly, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. "Thank you, Uncle Cecil," she whispered into his ear. "For everything." He hugged her back, his voice thick with emotion. "You're welcome, Addie. You deserve all the happiness in the world." As the evening drew to a close, Cecil found himself walking along the edge of the forest, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the warmth of the day. He paused at the spot where he had last seen the wolves, his eyes scanning the darkened trees. For a moment, he thought he heard a distant howl, a sound that echoed through the night, resonating deep within him. It was a reminder that the wild was still out there, that life continued, even after the flames had burned through it. Cecil smiled to himself, feeling a sense of peace settle over him. He had returned home, faced the flames, and now, like the forest, he was reborn. The wolves were out there, and so was he, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.